Chapter 25, AP World, Guided Reading. Question 1. What three factors combined to accelerate globalization after World War II? You can think of globalization in basically three different ways. You can have cultural globalization, economic globalization, and political globalization. Cultural globalization would be the worldwide spread and intermingling and interaction of various cultural forces. So if you say, for example, if you think of pop culture, so the United States is responsible for a lot of the world's pop culture, let's say major pop culture phenomenons like the Marvel movies are enjoyed throughout the world. You could think of something along the lines of, K-pop as a cultural phenomenon that originates from outside of the United States. Ultimately, cultural globalization means that the manifestation of culture isn't isolated, that it's much less likely that there's gonna be just an American culture or just a French culture or just a Chinese culture. That significant elements of both American and French and Chinese culture will all contribute to the individual cultures of those three different countries. In other words, we're talking about a blending of cultural practices. Maybe not a blending's not the best way to think about it, but an amalgamation of or a combination of various cultural forces depending on what country you live in. Economic globalization is probably more significant than cultural globalization. Economic globalization is the idea that the economies of the world are no longer isolated from one another, are no longer independent from one another. So a perfect example would be the idea that you might buy a Ford F-150 truck in Riverhead, New York, and maybe that truck was assembled in a Ford plant in Kentucky or in Michigan. But the steel made to construct that Ford truck may have come from Canada, and some of the components or parts would have been pre-assembled in Mexico, and maybe certain parts of it are, and so on. So the economic product of a specific country, the economic product of a specific company doesn't necessarily, and in fact, I would say rarely, occurs entirely within one country. There are probably very few products in the United States that people consume that are solely the product of the United States. So the extreme interconnectedness of global economies that, Apple builds iPhones in China, but then designs them in California. This is fundamentally what economic globalization is about. Now, political globalization is directly connected to economic globalization. Political globalization is the idea that countries might deliberately might deliberately coordinate their policies. And really, the way this manifests itself practically in the real world is in international organizations. So if we look at organizations such as the United Nations and any of the United Nations various agencies. Another good example of political globalization, and it dovetails perfectly with economic globalization, is the International Monetary Fund. And closely related to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. There's this idea that the that there have to be institutions that are separate from individual states, and that those institutions are comprised of elements of each member state, but that they are separate in theory from the local political agendas of their member states. So that's what globalization is. Globalization is essentially the gradual eroding of the separation of states in the world. Whether that separation is cultural, whether that separation is economic, or whether that separation is political, gradually what we have seen since World War II is an increasing interconnectedness rather than separateness amongst the countries of the world. What three factors combined to accelerate globalization after World War II? The first is that there were a variety of new institutions deliberately created to help avoid the sorts of conflicts that led to the Great Depression and World War II. Specifically, this would include the United Nations. The second factor that contributed to globalization would be advanced technology. The advent of satellite technology that allowed for greater and more instantaneous global communication, the spread of initially TV and radio broadcasting, but then, of course, ultimately the internet, meant that technology allowed for instantaneous or near instantaneous shared experiences, whether those experiences might be cultural in the form of, let's say, the World Cup, or even, the global audience for the release of Nelson Mandela, or it could be something along the lines of business. Technology allows for greater ease of interconnectedness in business. So it means that you could have part of your company operating in let's say, India, and another part of your company operating in Thailand, but your home base is back in the United States. Having the internet, phone, global communication networks makes it easier to have this economic and cultural interconnectedness. The third factor accelerating globalization after World War II would simply be the fact that there were countries participating in the global community that had not participated previous to this. Probably most significantly, this means the United States. The United States, after World War I, had not joined the League of Nations. The United States, after World War I, had not reached out to try to intensify its connections throughout the globe. Amongst other things, the United States erected economic barriers to the rest of the world in the form of the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. Because the United States, and because the Soviet Union and other powers became active participants in this political globalization, it meant that there was more meat on the bones, essentially. The fact that the United States was now participating in global affairs that had turned its back on its previous policy of isolationism meant that things could be taken more seriously. If the United States is involved, it means that the most powerful economy is interested in what is being said. So that gives it that much more importance. So to sum up, the three factors that combined to accelerate globalization after World War II were that there were these new international institutions that facilitated interaction between states. There was technology that now meant that, amongst other things, communication could be instantaneous or near instantaneous across the globe, meant that there was simply a greater interconnectedness. And thirdly, there was now genuine and legitimate participation in the global community by certain states, most specifically and most importantly being the United States. Question 2. What has been the general focus of UN efforts since its founding, and has it been successful? The United Nations quickly became active in defining and promoting human rights. One of the first acts of the United Nations was the issuing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which laid out rights such as freedom of religion and access to education, and also sought to establish a base definition of how humans should treat other humans. This basic idea of what are human rights. The United Nations has focused on childhood education. It has focused on increasing women's rights throughout the world. It has, targeted human trafficking, child labor. The United Nations has sought to progress the world really on this, in the realm of human rights. The UN has had mixed success. Unfortunately, the success of the United Nations relies largely on the participation of its member states. At the very top of the United Nations is the United Nations Security Council, which is made up of 5 permanent members and another 5 rotating members. But the 5 permanent members, and those are China, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France, any one of those can veto unilaterally any measure put before the Security Council. So generally speaking, if there are major rivalries amongst any of those 5 permanent member states, then that means that nothing will get done through the Security Council. Okay. That's why, in terms of influencing international peacekeeping, that means that when the United Nations has attempted to influence regional conflicts, its success has been limited because, the Soviet Union was never going to get along with the United States. And same thing now between Russia and the United States. And China is always going to have its agenda. So truly the success of the United Nations has come not through really what was its original intent, which was to try to, moderate global conflicts. Its greatest success has been through its human rights campaigns. By the late 20th century, child marriages had dropped off rapidly. Educational access throughout the world has expanded steadily. Child labor has dropped. Greater access to education and the necessities of living, like clean water. The United Nations has been successful in eradicating certain diseases. So the success of the United Nations could better be characterized as through soft power, rather than necessarily through the traditional powers of, influencing military campaigns. Question 3. How has the rise of multinational corporations contributed to globalization? Look, it's pretty straightforward. If you lend your lawnmower to your neighbor, you've got this really nice ride-on lawnmower. For some reason, it's got heated seats. I don't know why, but it's a really cool lawnmower. And you let your neighbor borrow it. You're not then going to sit by and watch your neighbor's house burn down with your really nice, fancy heated seat lawnmower in the garage. If you have a shared financial or material connection or interaction with another state, and that material interaction is significant enough, you and that material interaction is significant enough, the safety and preservation of this state is going to be a priority for you. Simply put, if there's business to be done, if you have a financial interest that transcends international borders, then that's going to influence diplomatic cooperation. If Google has data centers in Ireland and Singapore and Australia and South Africa, then that means that Google, which is an American company and has an extraordinarily important role to play in the American economy, that means that Google would serve as the link between those countries. If a Chinese bank loans money to an American bank, or if an American bank loans money to the Kenyan government, and so forth, if there's money on the table, if there's money to be made, then economic interconnectedness would usually influence how hostile or how friendly states could be to one another. A state is much more likely to attack another state if they have no economic connection than if they do have an economic connection. So that means that simply through business, countries around the world have become closer, have established more open lines of communication. Countries might not necessarily see eye to eye on everything, but if the wealthy and the powerful in those respective countries stand to gain financially from peace rather than conflict, then there's a very, very good chance that that's what you're going to get. Okay, question 4. What is cultural globalization? I touched on this briefly in the earlier question. And cultural globalization is it's the most obvious aspect of globalization. You have part of cultural globalization is part of the economics. You have internationally consumed goods. Sony PlayStations are designed and constructed in Japan, but they're sold and used throughout the world. If we're talking about art, if it's music, if it's scientific conferences, you have an exchange of and a combination of or interaction between cultural forces from previously very separate cultures, previously very separate states. One of the most classic examples of cultural globalization, is the spread of fast food restaurants from the United States, and most famously McDonald's. McDonald's gets its start of course, in the United States in 1955, and it started spreading internationally in 1967. It opened restaurants in Canada and Puerto Rico. But by 1998, so roughly 40 years after it started, McDonald's had spread to 109 countries overall. Cultural globalization has not always been widely accepted. There are aspects of every culture that are likely going to be unacceptable to another culture. There are very notable objections, for example, within the Muslim world to how women dress or women's rights in general. There are specific attitudes towards diet. Alcohol consumption is frowned upon in many cultures throughout the world. Acceptance of LGBTQ lifestyles is also something that is controversial in various cultures throughout the world. Many cultures feel threatened by the influence of outside cultures. There are traditional societies that want to keep things the way that they have always been, and they are resistant to the idea that their culture might become eclipsed by a more dominant culture, such as a very secular, materialistic Western European culture or Western cultures such as the United States. Question 5. How has the global industrial economy changed in the years since World War II? I think it's fair to say that you could sum this up in one sentence, and it is that industrialization or industrial power is now not exclusively controlled by Western Europe. Before World War II, outside of Europe, there was really only one true industrial power, and that would have been Japan. But since World War II, there has been something of an industrialization of the world. In 1900, it had been estimated that only about 1/5 of the global population lived in industrial societies, at 20%. But by 2000, that figure had advanced to 60%. Importantly, countries like China and India began to develop more simplistic industrial economies, probably industrial economies that were closer to the industrial economies in Western Europe in the early years of the 20th century. But nonetheless, China, India, and other countries previously not industrialized became active participants in the global industrial economy. Essentially, the big change is that industrialization is now something that happens internationally. Certain parts of the world lag behind the rest of the world. Large parts of Africa remain very unindustrialized. But places like Ethiopia, Uganda, in Africa, if you look at Brazil and Mexico, industrialization and industrialized output, as opposed to simple agriculture or mineral extraction or resource extraction, has become far more prevalent in question 6. How has globalization affected our environment? In what ways are our environmental challenges exacerbated by the legacy of colonialism and imperialism? Simply put, globalization has not been good for the environment. If we think about it, probably the number one threat to the global environment would be climate change. And climate change is a direct result of the uptick, the dramatic increase in the production of greenhouse gases as a result of human activity. This human activity, or essentially the main source of these greenhouse gases, is industrialized economic activity. And so, if there is increased industrial activity globally, in other words, if globalization leads to industrial activity in more parts of the world, then that means that there's going to be more greenhouse gases being produced. If the benefits of industrialization, more people driving more cars, will result in more greenhouse gases being emitted. So industrial and economic progress, unfortunately, has also led to negative consequences for the environment. There have been attempts at international agreements to address global warming, but every time it seems that we get closer and closer to a degree of international cooperation on this, political agendas in various states, very often the United States, interfere with this process. In many ways, our environmental challenges are exacerbated by the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And here's how it works. Many of the former colonial powers, many of the former major Western states, their economies have evolved significantly beyond beginning or mid-level industrialization. Their economies have, just simply by the nature of the economies, moved away from the more polluting aspects of industrialization. Let's say just coal-powered electricity generation, for example, or deforestation, or mineral extraction. The problem, though, is now that we have an understanding of the threat that industrialization poses for our environment and therefore for our planet and our people, these societies, Western societies, who have had their era of extreme pollution, but that era is behind them, they are now calling on developing nations who are just starting to industrialize and who are still in the phase of, let's say, quote unquote, dirty industrialization. Now those states are being told, no, wait a second, you're not allowed to develop your economy because it's bad for the environment. To which those states can just respond, so what you're telling us is, for the longest time while we were like imperial subjects, you were telling us we couldn't industrialize, that we had to be producers for your benefit. We couldn't industrialize while you guys reaped the benefits of industrialization, of this dirty industrialization. And now, here we are, with imperialism and the colonial era well behind us. Now you're telling us that we're not allowed to go through the same economic development that you got to go through. So we have these former colonial powers now telling countries in Africa and Asia that they're not allowed to develop their economy in a certain way, even though the problems that exist now have been, the foundation for those problems have been laid by these Western European industrial economies. So one could speculate that if the development of the global economy had been more equitable in the 19th century, maybe in the 18th century, if there had been more balance globally in terms of economic development, that we might not have a situation now where we have a significant proportion of the world that is now finally having its day in the sun economically and industrially and technologically speaking. But now they're being told that they're not allowed to do it. You could very well speculate that if there had been more equitable treatment during the colonial era, that there might be a greater sense of global cooperation in addressing the climate crisis.